We are working through the life of Christ, and we are at another turning point, if you want to put it that way. We began looking at his person, if you will. We saw that he was deity, that he was humanity. We began to explore some of the signs that he offered to declare to people in his actions who he was. We saw those signs in his miracles, and we then began to listen to some of his teaching and just his style of teaching in this kind of mystic, kind of cryptic kind of way as he taught through parables. This morning, in the passage that we read, it's a turning point. And I have entitled this morning just from the text, The Lord of the Sabbath. There's a conflict that happens. And if you know the Gospels at all, and if you've read them with even half an eye open, you know that there's a constant tension between Jesus and the Pharisees. And wherever there is this human, self-centered, self-made religion, and it comes up against the truth, there is always conflict. And Jesus isn't looking for this conflict, it's just natural. And there's a lesson for us even in that, for any of us who want to stand for the truth, that just by virtue of declaring truth, there is always going to be pushback. There will always be a reaction. And in fact, you always know the weakness of the church when she seems to get along with the world and the world doesn't seem to push against the church. You know there is some compromise somewhere. The truth by nature divides. It's not the intention of Christ to do so. It just happens. And this is really a turning point, and we'll see in the text exactly what this comes to. I've just divided this text for the sake of it. I don't know why I did it this way. I always feel insecure about the whole thing, but here we are. Divided this into three simple little points. The Pharisees' condemnation. We're then going to look at this text and we're going to see Jesus' confrontation, and then we're going to see the Pharisees' declaration. Just the response to this whole thing. What is going on? We read the text this morning. We read that together, and by the way, you read extremely well. Thank you very much for your help with that. Matthew chapter 12, verse 1, we begin to see that there is a conflict. And the Pharisees are all about condemning Jesus. Matthew 12:1, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry. They began to pluck heads of grain to eat. Sounds pretty simple. Sounds fairly straightforward. Hard for our Gentile minds to see there's any problem with what's going on, but alas, there is. Now, just for the sake of clarity, we talked about this a little bit when we spoke about the four soils, that the property lines were kind of vague, that people didn't always take their property as mine and the way it went, and it was perfectly fine to walk through somebody else's land. In fact, if your place was direct line with the town, whatever the case, you would walk from your door and you would just walk around across whatever field. Shortest distance between 2 points is always a straight line, and if that means you go through Farmer Joe's field, so be it. And that's just the way it was. And so that's where they are. The disciples and Jesus are just walking along one of these paths that cuts through somebody's field, and they are grabbing heads of grain as they go. Luke tells us that they took the kernels of the grain and they were rubbing it in their hands. This was separating the chaff from the good part on the inside. They would probably blow the chaff away or shake it out until would just be a handful of grain. And as they walk along, they would just pop this in their mouth like you would while you were handling a handful of peanuts or the like. And then when they were done with that, they'd grab another handful and start again, and they were just making a meal. The word in the text that they were hungry, it's actually the same word that's used in Matthew 4 when it says that Jesus was hungry after fasting for 40 days. So they are seriously hungry. Now I'm not suggesting they were to the point of death or that they had fasted 40 days, but this was not just a snack to them, this was a necessity. And so they are just doing that. Do you see any big deal in that? Well, of course, if you don't, it's because you're not a Pharisee. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." I'm sure I don't need to tell you that word Sabbath is talking about their Saturday, the day of rest. This comes, of course, from the Old Testament, and it is the word Sabbaton, which actually means to cease. means to stop working. That's the idea of the thing. From Friday sundown to Saturday sundown, there was to be no work. Now these Pharisees, it seems, they were hiding in the grain. You can almost hear a tattletale kind of finger pointing, kind of, your disciples, I caught you. You can almost hear that. I'm obviously reading between the lines, but how did they know? Were they following him, looking for something that he was doing wrong? Probably so. Were they hiding around, looking for something? Could be. But they immediately spotted something, and they came with their big bony fingers to point it in Jesus' face. We caught you. You and your disciples are breaking the law. Oh, really? Oh, really? They obviously, Jesus immediately knows, which everybody knew anyways, the Pharisees are on some kind of different page than everybody else. In fact, Deuteronomy 23, verse 24 and 25, if you know the law, says this: if you go into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes, and as many as you wish, but you shall not put any in your bag. If you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. It's perfectly legal in the law what they were doing. Walking through somebody's field and plucking some heads of grain, it's not even stealing in the law. It would be stealing if they harvested it and went and took it for themselves. That would be wrong. You could go into your neighbor's vineyard and eat as many grapes as you could shove in your mouth, but you weren't allowed to collect them in any kind. That's stealing. They are not actually breaking or defying the law in any way. What are these people whining about? They have this sense that the Sabbath is something that it's not. Now these people, the disciples who were picking this, knew full well that on the Sabbath was just that. Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11, I'll not read this. Of course, we covered this well I'd like to think we covered it well, when we were talking about the Ten Commandments this past summer. Doesn't that feel like 100 years ago already, and yet just this summer? Doesn't that word even feel good when it comes off your tongue? Summer. Anyways, alas, I digress. Exodus 20 reminds us of what the Sabbath is, and in case you're not familiar with the Sabbath, there it is. That's what we know. Does this say anything anywhere in this about plucking heads of grain while you walk through somebody's field? Do you see that anywhere in there? Well, Jesus knew it wasn't there. And in fact, the only place that you could find anything of the sort in regards to how to behave on the Sabbath was found in the Pharisees' books of texts that they had put together called the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is vast and huge. I don't know how many volumes come in the Talmud. There's an example of a modern-day printing of the Talmud. This is a huge collection of ideas and doctrines that the Pharisees, who are just teachers, rabbis, scribes, all of these men who are familiar with the law, they came up with them. So, for example, you would have a law in the Old Testament. And then they would sit down and they would decide for themselves, how do you live out that law? Well, this is what it means you can and cannot do on a particular time or in a particular circumstance. And when you make a rule, it always turns out, conveniently enough, just to confuse us, there's always something that comes up and you say, yeah, but what if this happens while you're doing that and you can't help it? Oh, now we have to go back to the rule, we have to make an addendum to the rule, a clarification for the rule, and then this. And now another thing comes up. Well, what happens if this happens when you're doing that, and then the law? Okay, let's get together again, and it became this gigantic, enormous, bulky, tremendously confusing piece of literature that they called the Talmud. And they lived by this, they breathed by this, and this to them was held up equal with Scripture. And what is going on immediately here is that these men are confronting Jesus not with the truth of the Word of God of what the Sabbath is about, but what they have haggled out in their own quiet places and was written in the Talmud that then says you are not allowed to do this on that day, and you're doing it. How dare you? There are actually 24 chapters, I'm not sure how long a chapter is, 24 chapters on things you are not allowed to do on the Sabbath day. It's not in the Bible, it's in the Talmud. There are actually 39 things that you're not allowed to do on the Sabbath. Let me read them to you and give you a sense of how tremendously bulky their religion was. Make you be thankful you grew up a Gentile. Sowing, these are things you cannot do on the Sabbath. Sowing, plowing. Now I know, just let me pause it along the way here. Immediately you're saying, well, that's not a problem for me. No, you don't understand. This goes all the way through your life. This immediately means, for example, you are not allowed to spit on the Sabbath day. Doesn't that make sense to you? Clearly that would be in there. You're like, what? Well, that's because you're not Jewish. See, if you spit, your spit might land on a seed in the ground, and you might be tempted to cover that over, and you would be planting. So you cannot spit because you might be planting. You can't grab a chair in your home and drag a chair. Did you know that? You can pick a chair up on the Sabbath, but you cannot drag a chair because the leg of the chair might drag a line of dirt, if you have a dirt floor, in, and you would be plowing. You can't plow on the Sabbath, no dragging a chair. Just so you know, that's how this became interpreted. So on the surface, you look at that and you say, well, that's not a problem. No, it is a problem. Because every single one of these came along with them a bulk of things that included. And your life became an utter, absolute burden every time the Sabbath came. And Jesus' disciples, I've highlighted the next 5, because if I see this right, they have now broken the next 5 laws of the Sabbath in the Talmud. And so this isn't just one little thing that they've done. They have been reaping, that is, removing stalks of grain from another stalk. In fact, it was illegal, if that's the word. It was forbidden, perhaps is a better word, to climb a tree on the Sabbath, because you might put your foot on a branch or a twig and snap it off, and that would be reaping. You are not to remove any piece of one plant from another plant, and clearly the disciples are reaping. They're gathering, they're binding. Now, binding would be taking the full sheaves, but it doesn't matter. They're gathering, they're putting things in their hands. You cannot collect something and gather it from its original source. If you had a basket of apples and the apples spilled, you would actually be allowed to gather those apples because you are not reaping them because they were already reaped from their original source. Aren't you glad you can pick up your apples on a Sabbath? But you can't go out and collect an onion from the ground or a lemon from a tree or whatever the case if you happen to be wanting that for a daily meal. You can't pull something from a plant. Clearly they're doing that. You can't thresh or extract. That is, you can't remove an undesirable from a desirable. They were rubbing their hands together. Can you imagine that? How horrible a breaking of the law is that. You cannot do this on the Sabbath with your grain between your hands. They were blowing. They were separating. They're winnowing. These people are horrible people. Clearly, they're not obeying any of these rules whatsoever, and they're sorting. They're actually removing what they want from what they don't want. On the Sabbath, the rules are, if you have a bowl of peanuts and raisins, if I can remember this right, it gets so confusing. If you have a bowl of peanuts and raisins and you don't want the peanuts, it is against the law on the Sabbath to remove the peanuts because now you're sorting. You don't want those peanuts. But it is okay on the Sabbath to pick out the thing you do want. If you want the raisins, you can pull out the raisins and you can eat those. Pardon me? You can't grind, can't sift, can't knead, can't bake, can't shearing wool, washing wool, beating wool, drying wool, spinning, weaving, making 2 loops. I'm not sure what that is. This is an ancient thing. It sounds like something to do with, obviously sewing or creating something. Weaving 2 threads, separating 2 threads. If you have a thread hanging off your clothes, you are not allowed to cut that thread on the Sabbath. You have to come to church looking like a ragamuffin because you are separating that thread from your clothes. Can't do that. It's work. Tying, untying, sewing stitches, tearing, trapping. This is an interesting one. Modern day conundrum. If you're at a picnic and there is a wasp that comes flying around and lands nearby and all the kids are scared, and are you allowed, here's a question for you, are you allowed to pick up a glass and trap that wasp so that nobody gets stung? It's a Sabbath day. Is that okay? What about if you have one of those sticky fly traps that you pull and it's sitting in your kitchen and we don't want to visit your house because you've got one of those hanging in your kitchen. And a fly comes around and it's a Sabbath day and you know that that is in your home and a fly comes along and lands on it. You just trapped a fly. Are you breaking the Sabbath? Guess what? Yes, you are. I mean, you think on one level, well, I don't bear trap. This is fine. No. You don't understand. This goes on and on and on. Slaughtering. Well, thankfully, I don't have to worry about that. I'm not a serial killer. Now, flaying, tanning, scraping hide, marking hides, cutting hide to shape. This is not just hide, obviously this would go into materials and all. Writing 2 or more letters, 39 things. That doesn't mean, Dear John, finish your letter, fold it up, put it in an envelope. It means 2 alphabetical letters. You can't write A, B, you're done for the day right there. That's it. That would not really bode well in a Baptist church when we want you to sign your check. You know what I'm saying? It's teasing. Erasing 2 or more letters, building, demolishing, extinguishing a fire. I got to tell you this. Did you know it's actually illegal or forbidden on the Sabbath to put out a fire? If you're at the stove and your pot of oil catches on fire, you are not to put this fire out. You kidding me? Unless it becomes a life-threatening fire, and then you are required to put it out. So what I would do is grab it, pull it to the curtains, light the curtains on fire. Now I can now put it out. I don't know how to do this. Not Jewish enough to work out what to do. But you can't build a fire. This is one of the reasons you can't kindle a fire. 37. That's one of the reasons you couldn't start your car. Modern day Jews can't drive because you're lighting a spark in your spark plug, and you can't switch a light switch on because you're arcing electricity. You're making a spark, and you're making a fire. And you can't turn on your electrical appliance. You can't open your fridge door because your light bulb comes on, so you have to unscrew your light bulb. You can't open your freezer door because if the heat goes in and the motor turns on, kicks on, you have just built a fire on the Sabbath. You can't do that. The Sabbath is a day of rest, remember, not a day of a burden. Yeah, right. By the way, as we became to understand a little more, I'll try not to go on about this, but I just find the whole thing fascinating. As we started to understand a little more about this whole notion of how electricity worked and realize that it's not actually building a fire, because fire is a chemical reaction and electricity is a physical thing and whatever else. So then they realized, well, what you're actually doing is building, because you're building a circuit. You're completing a circuit, which, by the way, is number 38. You can't put the finishing touches on anything. So you can't complete a circuit. You can't build anything. So you can't push that light switch on, which is why in many areas in Israel, and of course in Jewish parts of a big city, there are in apartment buildings elevators, Sabbath day elevators, that just go up and down at every floor and go just all day long, so that you can get in and you don't have to push any buttons or build any circuits or start anything happening, because you wouldn't want to break the Sabbath. And if you're making a salad, by the way, you can't chop up your lettuce all the way to completion. You can't chop your tomatoes. I'm not making this up. You can't chop your tomatoes, this is modern day Judaism, until the size you would like them for that salad. Everything has to be a little bit bulkier and a little bit awkward, a little bit, well, I didn't really finish it. Nothing can be done, finished on the Sabbath. Where does that come from? You find that anywhere in the Bible? It's in the Talmud. 39, I'll stop going on about this, transporting an object between a private domain and a public domain. This is a big argument. What in the world is a private domain and a public domain? And this was written so many hundreds of thousands of years ago that today we're still arguing what exactly that constitutes. And so we have people that go outside and say, well, my neighborhood is a private domain. So as long as I'm walking through my neighborhood, I can carry the Torah off to church. You're not allowed to carry anything into a private domain. You can't wear a necklace. You're carrying it. You can't have change in your pocket. You can't have keys in your pocket. You can't have a wallet with you. You can't carry anything for a distance of 4 cubits. A cubit is, of course, from here to here, it's about 6 feet or so. Anyways, we'll stop going on about that. My point is simply, doesn't it make more sense when we read at the end of chapter 11, when Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Talk about weary. Their whole lives are governed by this weight of what I can't do and what I have to do and how I have to be in order to please God. This constant striving, constant working. So Jesus is being condemned because they've broken the law. Thank you for your patience. And now Jesus turns the table and he says, basically, who do you think you are to be telling me how to live on the Sabbath? Who wrote this law anyways? Is basically Jesus' approach. From verse 2. Jesus, he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Jesus is referencing back now to 1 Samuel 21. I'm sure you've got that text memorized. And it's a time when David has been anointed king and he's fleeing from Saul. And in his running from Saul, he's running for his life, he doesn't have time to grab any provisions, and he comes to the temple. And he and his men are hungry. And he enters into the temple and he asks, do you have any food? And they say, all we have is the showbread. If you remember about the temple, there's a golden table in the temple, and on that are 12 loaves of bread that are baked every Sabbath and replaced every Sabbath, and it's symbolic of the presence of God, the fellowship with God, the breaking of bread that will be between believers, that Christ is the bread of life, and etc. There's all this symbolism wrapped up in what's going on in the temple. And this bread is only ever to be eaten by the priests. And on the Sabbath, when it's exchanged, the priests can take it and the priests can eat it. David comes in 1 Samuel 21. Do you have any bread? The only bread we have is the showbread. And guess what? They give it to him. Jesus says, can you explain that to me? Basically, he's saying to the Pharisees, if you have all these laws about the Sabbath and what you can't do, then how is it okay that the priests defied the ceremonial law and gave David that bread? He was never condemned in Scripture. He is not to eat that bread. Explain that to me. They have no answer. They don't understand this text. All we know from the text is what is so blatantly obvious. What did the priests ultimately do? They circumvented the law to provide mercy. And the need overrode the law. Jesus has a second illustration for them. He says to them, have you not read? Now that in itself is a slap in the face. That's like saying to a swimmer, have you never been in a pool? I mean, have you not read? These people have studied the law their whole lives. Have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? He throws this back to them. You got to love the confrontational spirit that Jesus has towards these Pharisees. Not a concern in his heart on their reaction to what he's about to say. These priests are working every single day. Can I just remind you that on our Sabbath, I work every single Sabbath? Nobody seems to condemn me. Thank you very much. What do you think is going on right here? Some of you have to work on the Sabbath. If you're a firefighter or an EMT or whatever the case, a doctor or whatever is going on, the world has to function. Talked about the Sabbath again in the summer. We'll not get too deep into that. But these priests, they worked. And Jesus throws this at them. You're going to condemn us for taking a little bit of grain, for rubbing our hands like that, and for popping this in our mouth, when you don't even condemn the priests who they kill animals, they flay animals, they sacrifice animals, they break way more laws in your Talmud than we have. And they stoke a fire, they build a fire, they put the fire out, they control the ashes, they put more wood on the fire, they gather wood, they put another animal on, they do 2 animal sacrifices, once for themselves and once for other people. I mean, they are constantly breaking the Sabbath. You have no words for them. And you come and you tell us that we broke the Sabbath? Who do you think you are, is what Jesus is saying to them. And he confronts this man-made religion. Can I just remind you that we all have within us this ability to create something more out of a religion than is really there? We always have this sense in our hearts that I have to do in order to please God. Jesus confronts us all. I tell you, he says, something greater than the temple is here. You know, I wish that we had Jewish ears to have the back of our head blow off when we hear those words. We don't really fully understand how profound that declaration was. Something greater than the temple is here. This is ultimately a claim to deity. Jesus is declaring, you think the temple is great? You think the temple is important? I am even better than the temple. The temple, I mean, this declaration, if I can just begin to get your head around it, greater than the temple. The temple was the place where the people of God, where you would meet with God, where you would go with your sacrifice to make peace with God. Jesus was declaring, I am better than the temple. You want to be right with God? You come to me. The temple was the place of continual, ongoing sacrifice. Jesus was going to be the place that would put sacrifices to end once for all. Sacrifices that would continue, and that priest would die, and the next in line would rise up, and he would be the priest, and then that priest would die, and the next person would be priest. And Jesus says, I am greater than all of that system. I am the once-for-all priest that satisfied the wrath of God. I am better than the temple. The temple was ultimately man-made and temporal. It was a symbol of all the things that Christ would do. And he was saying, I am that thing. This is a declaration that would fly in their face. I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Hosea 6:6 is what Jesus is quoting there. I desire steadfast love. This is in the law. This is in the Old Testament. God prefers mercy and love over a sacrifice. And ultimately what we realize even from the Old Testament is God is only concerned ultimately with your heart. You can go through all the outward motions. You can be doing all these outward things. But if they're not lubricated by a heart that is right with God, a heart that loves God, a heart that seeks to genuinely serve God, it means nothing what you do with your hands. That is true for any one of us who thinks somehow you're appeasing God by showing up in church on a Sunday morning, that somehow you're going through some ritualistic thing if your heart is not right. Can I just tell you, even as believers, we can get in that place where we just go through the motions of the motions and we just slog along and do our thing. Oh, I guess I should read my Bible. I'll sit down and read my Bible, and I'm just reading it because I'm supposed to. Oh, yeah, I'm supposed to pray. I guess I should pray. We've all been in those places. You get dry. You get boring. You get routine. Oh, it's time to go to church. I guess I'll go to church. Your heart's not there. You're just doing the motions. And God is saying to me, your motions mean nothing. Your heart needs to be right. Can I just say that's perhaps a good rebuke for all of us? We need to always be refreshed by the lubricating work of the Spirit of God. The oil of the Spirit that needs to go into our gears and lubricate those gears so that there's a freshness about this, a reality about this, because God cares about our heart. And he's condemning these Pharisees who are seeking to condemn Jesus. And he says these words, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. That's a punch in the face. Don't you, he's saying to them, don't you tell me what I can do on my Sabbath. I wrote the Sabbath. Don't you be telling me what the rules are for the Sabbath. I designed the Sabbath. Don't you be coming along and telling me if I broke the Sabbath or not. I am in charge of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is my day. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. That was like throwing water or throwing fuel on a fire. I mean, for them, a religious perspective, they would have nothing of it. And of course, this is what the turning point is in this entire event. Matthew 12, I'll just read through the text and close from that last sentence. He went on from there, entered the synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him? He said to them, which one of you who has a sheep that falls into a pit on the Sabbath will not take hold of it and lift it out? Probably been silence in that room. Probably a few shepherds in there who thought, well, yeah, I've done that. I mean, that's okay. I guess you can do that on the Sabbath, but you're not allowed to do any other kind of work. Well, why is that okay? Jesus throws it at them of how much more value is a man than a sheep. So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. He said to the man, stretch out your hand. The man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy, like the others. And the Pharisees had steam and flames 40 feet out each one of their ears. They just blew their tops because they could not stand the truth when it's confronted by their man-made religion. They could not see through their own pride, through their own arrogance, through their own decision of this is what we say the Bible teaches. And when someone comes along and says, no, I am the one who wrote the book, I am telling you what it says, and your religion is wrong. Bam! Verse 14. The Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. They wanted nothing of it. Can I just remind us all that this is what truth does, that truth always divides, and ultimately, though we don't look for it, it ultimately brings an ultimate place where people want nothing but to destroy those people who are speaking the truth, whether physically or whatever the case would be. Persecution abounds. And this is the turning point. And this is why we've stepped into this text this morning. We're beginning to look towards Easter. We're moving towards the cross. And I wanted to point out that this is the beginning of the end. This is the reason that Jesus begins down that road. And we'll pick up the story as we carry on following the life of Christ. Can we pray?